Okay, so in the meantime, we're going to continue a little bit about this idea of foolishness. So we got to continue telling the saga of this son-in-law. The father-in-law obviously realized that his kid couldn't do any business, so instead he figures he's going to hire him for his own business. Maybe he'd be able to do something simple, like put him in the marketing department. So he says, "Listen, kid, I've got one of my businesses is I've got a hardware store, and I want you to put up billboards, on the highway. Make sure that people can see what's going on. They know who we are, they know what we do, they know we have quality products." So the next day, father-in-law is driving down the highway, and he sees a huge billboard, and on the billboard there's a picture of Jesus on the cross, and the tagline is, "They used Goldberg's nails." And he's like, "Oh my God, I cannot believe that he did this. This guy's completely out of his mind." He speeds up, he gets to the hardware store. He comes in, he grabs the kid, he says, "You can't do that. That's terrible. You cannot do that." He says, "What I do wrong?" He says, "People are going to be furious. That's not, you can't, you have to do something, far more, just take it down and put something else up." The next morning, he's driving down the highway, and he sees same billboard, same tagline. They use Goldberg. He sees a cross, and Jesus is on the floor right next to the cross, laying there. And the tagline says, "They did not use Goldberg's nails." So now we have more of this foolishness, more of this silliness. So the previous Rebbe, his style of writing is very, very effusive, if you will. It's beautiful, beautiful writing in the original, in the Yiddish in particular, in his sichos more than in his maimarim. Maimarim, of course, are much more structured and much more rigid in terms of their style. But in his talks, he would tell stories, and even his letters are just unbelievably colorful. And so you'll see a little bit of that here. And again, I did not quite slice everything out. Again, I'm using somebody else's translation here rather than my own. In the previous ones, I have used my own translations, and that way I could summarize things and place them the way I wanted to. Let me see if I can put the document here. This is going to take way too long. Okay, let's just go back to the actual link that you had, the original link that you had. I'll ask.
Right, and we're on chapter 3, right? We're finishing up chapter 3.
I believe so. Let me see.
Okay, good. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. So we are at fundamental nature of this godly soul is godliness. This is about halfway down. This is especially true of the unique spark of God that is related to the body of any particular individual. By means of this spark, the soul appreciates all godly things and is keenly aware of anything that opposes godliness. It wants no part of anything which godliness does not manifest. When faced with something that actually opposes godliness, he flees from it as from danger or death. Indeed, it is clear to the godly soul that spiritual death is much worse than physical death, and its only desire is to connect with godliness and to make vessels for godliness. So that's the natural state of the godly soul. The godly soul is such, and this is really, really important when we reflect on it ourselves, because people, typically say things about themselves that are such as, well, I'm not connected, or I don't feel and all that. And it's important to be able to realize that you do have that capability within yourself. In fact, is a natural capability, and it's just a matter of, as we're going to talk about, the coarseness that arises as a result of a person's interaction with the world and the way a person gets involved with the world. But the idea is critical of that every single Jew has this innate connection with godliness. And so over the next chapter and a half, he's going to talk about that, how that connection becomes disconnected and why a person feels that way. And it's the results of a person's own actions, as we've discussed in previous Maimarim. However, the gross materiality, I like the word coarseness, physical coarseness is better, and the self-assertiveness, the selfishness of the animal soul muzzle the spiritual tastes of the godly soul. They cause the godly soul to be withdrawn within one's body, basically. A person doesn't feel the godly soul as much because of the fact that they're involved and invested in physicality. Now, involvement and investment is obviously, that's a natural thing as well, because we are physical beings. So what kind of involvement and what kind of investment are we talking? As he says quite clearly here, this is self-evident. Pleasure-seeking, worldly enjoyment obscures one's sensitivity towards godliness. So focusing on the pleasure as opposed to a recognition of this is what I got to do, but focusing on the pleasures, and again, this is something we've discussed before, and that causes a coarseness and that causes a concealment within oneself. And indeed, in Hebrew, the very word for olam, world, olam, is related to the world, obscurity or concealment. And this situation is the very opposite of the ultimate purpose for which the universe was created, for God desired to have a dwelling place in the lower worlds by means of man's labor of refining his body and animal soul, his physical nature. The point is to be able to work with the world without getting distracted by it. When I was studying prior to my marriage, I was studying with a rabbi and in Cleveland, and at some point he had a niece or nephew who was getting married. We had to go to New York, so I said, "Come, we'll drive to New York together. We'll go rent a car." We go to Hertz Rent a Car, and he says, "I want the smallest car that you have." They said, "Well, we don't have any economy size, but we'll give you an upgrade. We've got a Ford Mustang." I was like, hey, let's go. I knew I was going to be driving the car as well. And, he said, "What's that?" And they said, "Well, it's a little bit of a bigger car." He goes, "I don't want a bigger car." They said, "Well, we don't have the smaller cars." I said, "Okay." I figured when we go outside and we see this car, he'll understand maybe he doesn't know the models per se. We go outside and there's a hot red Ford Mustang. There was absolutely no reaction whatsoever. He could have been getting into a 20-year-old Ford Mercury. It really did not make a difference to him whatsoever. It was quite remarkable, and not as if cars are what our society is all about, but it was good to see that there are some people who there's no reaction. There was just nothing there. It wasn't as if he needed to, there was no indulgence. There was no lack of indulgence. There was a complete and absolute. A car is a car. It's got an engine. It's got four wheels. It'll get me where I need to go. And that was it. I had fun with the car, but that was a different story. So getting distracted by these things on the side is a problem because, like we say here, man was placed in this world in order to sift it and refine it. Instead, the very opposite can occur. The world covers up the light of truth within him to the point where he becomes so coarse and so materially oriented that he loses every trace of spiritual perceptiveness. So you can talk to him about spirituality, you can talk to him about godliness, but he looks at you that, there's nothing there. And because he's so invested in physicality. And we're going to talk about invested being basically two elements. There's the emotional element, There's the fire and the passion and the excitement and everything that he is focused on in terms of what he bestows his energy into, which is one very, very important element of it. And then, of course, there's the intellect, what he thinks about, what he's considering, what he's falling asleep thinking about, what he wakes up thinking about, what he's really trying to understand. And that's another element. And then there's the opposite, which is his coolness towards things of spiritual value, his disinterest. So it's not just his interest in certain things, it's also his disinterest. All of those pieces together create this feeling of materialist, crass, self-focused life. And that's what the Rebbe says here. This contrary course of behavior is brought about when a person is dominated by his animal soul, which is firmly fixed and rooted in worldly desires. That is its nature and its goal. That's what he's pondering on, what he's thinking about. That's what he's talking about with energy, with zest. Exercise of these feelings, in particular, the enjoyment of worldly things, negates the divine soul's sensitivity towards godliness. And this happens mainly because the animal is intrinsically frigid with respect to spiritual matters. And that's how the animal soul is constituted. Its very name, the animal soul, describes it. It is focused on animalistic things. I took my kids to a horse farm the other day, and we're going to go horseback riding again today. I was talking to the trainer, and I said, "What does the animal enjoy about the riding?" Because he was talking about the fact that the animals, when they're in the pen, they know that they need to run, they know they need to do work, and so therefore they're focused on work. And specifically after about 45 minutes, their task is usually over, so they start heading towards the door because they're like, "Okay, I'm done." And sometimes the trainer needs to remind them, "No, I'm in charge. You're not in charge. You need to get back, keep doing the riding or running or whatever they're doing." And he started laughing. He said the animals don't like any part of this. The horses don't enjoy any element of the horseback riding experience. They're herd animals. All they want to do is sit in the field and eat. And that was very, very, very much about, of course, what we're discussing here. The animal soul wants nothing but the food that it feels that it deserves or it should be involved with. That's all it wants. It doesn't want the rider. It doesn't want to do the work. It needs to be trained to do the work. It needs to be convinced that doing the work is for its good. And that's all a crucial part of the process. So I said to the horse trainer, I said, it's funny because there are these two Hasidic sayings, and I never really understood them until you just explained this to me. One of them is in the Yiddish, "Medarf schmeißen die Pferd, bis sie sollen wissen, als is a Pferd." As he is a Pferd. You need to smack the horse until it knows that it's a horse. And the other one is, "Medarf schmeißen die Pferd, bis sie sollen werden ois Pferd." You need to smack the horse until it's no longer a horse. I said, now I understand both of these, not just in terms of the Hasidic terminology, but in terms of the horse training analogy, the actual original source of these things. The first statement is the understanding that the animal needs to be taught that it has a purpose, and its job is to be the horse. His job is to be to draw the carriage or to hold the reins, to hold the bit, and to be able to hold a rider and all that. It needs to know that it is a horse for a purpose besides for itself. The ultimate purpose is to be able to get it to the point that it's no longer a horse. In other words, it loses its sense of self-identity and becomes totally invested into the rider. And actually,
And
what I
then
learned was, go ahead.
I said, and then arbet via pferd.
Yes, that's exactly it. It works like a horse. That's exactly it.
Not if you beat him
But-
until he's not a horse.
What was that?
You said if you have to beat him until he's not a horse. Then why
So
would
he's
you
no longer-
walk like a horse?
Now he's invested in something else to the point where it's not just the animal that basically does work and goes eat. He's now completely focused on something bigger than himself. You get the horse to a certain point where it is totally subservient to the owner. It completely is the owner's. Then that's the ultimate training of the horse, where the horse will do whatever needs to be done.
And the
And there's
owners,
no identity.
okay. And the owners training.
So that's what we're trying to do with regards to our own horse within ourselves. Is we're trying to accomplish the same thing. The first process, of course, is to remind ourselves, okay, this is animalistic in its nature, and it needs to be put on the side in certain times, certain situations. It needs to be guided. It needs to be trained. That's the first stage. But the ultimate stage is to be able to get to the point that the animal soul is nothing but a driven by the rider, which is, of course, the godly soul. So the previous Rebbe continues and he says, all its vigor and all its feelings are directed only towards things that are animal in nature. This is what we, in fact, observe in people who are dominated by their animal nature. Not only are they devoid of the Torah's wisdom and of upright character, they moreover act like animals, trampling and scorning spiritual matters of which they have no conception, like an animal that lacks the sensitivity or the discernment to know whether it is trampling on the ground or plants or on men. These people scoff at the Torah and the mitzvahs. Some of these people choose their own paths. One mitzvah they decide to observe, another mitzvah they spurn, and so on. This results from the brazenness, cold insensitivity of the animal soul and the spirit of foolishness that it induces. So this is what the previous Rebbe, of course, we're talking about. This is printed in 1949. It was originally stated in, was it 1923, I believe. And so you can very much get a sense of what the previous Rebbe is dealing with in terms of the people that are around, of course, at the time. 1923 in particular, you had the Yevsektia, the Jewish section of the communists starting to grow in strength and putting down anything that was Jewish. And even in the United States, the previous Rebbe was dealing with a lot of this, not nearly the same kind of intensity as it was in the Soviet Union, but at the same time, the problems were still there. And the problems, of course, still exist nowadays as well, but he's talking about those people. He doesn't hold back. He talks about this trampling because of the fact that, of course, one of the elements of damages that are attributed to an ox in Talmudic law is the idea of trampling. Another one is goring. So he specifically speaks about the idea of trampling and goring, so to speak here, and that tramples over anything. In other words, he has no concern with the value of something whatsoever. He has no concern of what's going on, whether this is something that's important, whether there's something that's alive or anything of the sort. The animal just does what it was told to do. Excuse me, not what it's told to do, just does what its nature is to do. If it's, being, what's the word? Herded, one of them just herded. There's a stampede. And then obviously that's what happens. They just trample. There's no focus on whatever's going on. And goring is the idea, of course, specifically people that you're pulling out and focusing on an individual or a certain mindset or something like that that you're trying to damage. And that was certainly, those were issues that of course the previous rebel was fighting against. So moving over into the next chapter, because he just summarizes the idea so far that the animal soul is covering over the light of Torah, the ultimate light and truth of the fact that God put us here for a purpose. And in chapter 4, he goes through the same kind of idea. He continues it, and I really want to get to chapter 5. So I'm just going to summarize a lot of chapter 4, and you're welcome to go through it yourselves. I had summarized it already, but apparently we didn't get through it. So he says that in general, we have a connection to God. The connection is compared to a rope, because the verse says, Yaakov chevel nachalato. Yaakov has a cord of inheritance. And so the cord is described as a rope that is made up of 613 strands. And this rope that connects us with God, so to speak, is even such that even the lowest of Jewish people still have this connection. And that's the reason why the term Yaakov is described in the verse, because of course you have two different names of the Jewish people. You have Israel, and Yaakov, Jacob. And these two names are very interesting because they're complete opposites. Jacob was given that name when he was losing the battle, so to speak, with Esav. Esav came out first, and he was holding on to Esav's heel. So the word means the heel, which of course is the lowest part of the body. A person standing up, the lowest part, the part touching the ground, is his heel. Israel is when eventually Yaakov becomes transcendent. He becomes triumphant over Esav. He's struggling with the angel, and he finally is victorious. And the angel gives him the name Kisarita iman Hashima Melokim v'Tilchal. You struggled and you conquered over the with angels and with men, and you were victorious. So generally speaking, the Jewish people have these two within ourselves. Sometimes we are Israel, sometimes we are Yaakov. And depending on the context, we look at the two of them and see how they apply. In this case, we're saying that even somebody who is on Yaakov, that he is on the level of Akev, a heel, he still has the Yud in his name. He still has the connection with God. He still is firmly connected with God. But what does happen is that a person, of course, as a result of their casting away one of the mitzvot, over time, they cut one of those strings, the 613 strings, and this is all conceptually, of course. This is not physical, but you connect one of those connecting strands to God, and in that particular area, the soul is no longer connected to God, and the result, of course, is a weakening of the entire connection. So that's with regards to the general 613 mitzvot. Then you have a certain types of mitzvot which are much, much more intense, and those are ones in which a person is punished by karet. Karet means to be cut off, and spiritual excision, so to speak. And so what that represents is that a person has done something that has severed the connection as a larger connection, despite the fact that there is always still that deepest connection with the Jew to God, but that overt connection has been completely severed. And that's of course the reason why a person goes from one level to another. When a person lowers themselves, a person sits in one area and allows themselves to indulge and to go further into things that are inappropriate. So because that weakening becomes even weaker until it eventually fails. And that all comes, of course, from that same spirit of foolishness that a person doesn't realize that, look, I was created for a purpose. God created me with my particular unique constitution and capabilities and the elements of my soul, which are meant to be in this world to refine the world. And as a result of not doing things, and as a result of doing things that are incorrect and inappropriate, I am distancing myself and disconnecting myself from that ultimate purpose. And so that is a spirit of foolishness, because as soon as you get a person into the right mind frame and say, okay, are you doing something here? Are you accomplishing something in this world or not? And then the person can eventually get to the point where they should recognize that there's something greater than themselves. I have a relative who was very, very uninvolved with Judaism for a very long time, and he's still uninvolved, very, very cynical. And now as he's become older, he's
He wanted to put him
finding
away.
himself reflecting on his life in such a way where he realizes that he's created a significant distance, and that his life is not quite as full as his accomplishments, even though he became wealthy in different things, but he is not quite as full as he would like to. And the question is where he can be brought to at this point. Everybody obviously has there's no end to our ability to be able to make up for the past, because God is above time. But of course, every day that goes is a day that's lost, and that's something difficult. So chapter 5 is going to conclude this particular first mimer of the series. And that one's going to talk about this idea of the spirit of foolishness to the advantageous side. How the spirit of foolishness can be used in a positive side is not just a negative element. So with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to Rabbi Smith, because we have to get these kids out of here. We have horseback riding coming up,